May 5th, 1945. Hacksaw Ridge, Okinawa. American soldiers are scrambling down cargo nets, retreating from a 400-foot cliff under devastating Japanese counterattack. Artillery screams overhead. Machine guns rake the plateau. Officers shout orders to fall back, to abandon the position, to save whoever can still walk. 75 men can't walk. They're scattered across the plateau above, bleeding into coral rock, crying out for help that isn't coming. Military doctrine is clear. You don't sacrifice the living for the wounded when a position becomes untenable. But one man doesn't retreat. One skinny medic from Virginia who's never fired a shot, who was beaten by his own unit during training, who was called a coward by the very soldiers now bleeding on that ridge, stays behind, alone, unarmed. While Japanese soldiers advance through the smoke just yards away, Corporal Desmond Doss begins crawling toward the wounded, dragging them one by one to the cliff's edge, lowering them to safety with a rope. And with each man saved, he whispers, "Lord, please help me get one more." They had laughed at him. They had tormented him. They had sworn to shoot him themselves once combat started. Now this same man was risking everything to pull them from death's jaws. This is how conviction proved stronger than mockery, how faith moved beyond words into the most dangerous action imaginable, and how one of the most unlikely heroes in American military history saved 75 souls without ever compromising the beliefs that made him an outcast. Desmond Thomas Doss was born February 7, 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia. His father William was a carpenter and World War I veteran whose demons drove him to drink. His mother Bertha worked in a shoe factory and raised 3 children with unwavering Seventh-day Adventist devotion. In their modest home hung a framed poster of the 10 Commandments, each illustrated with biblical scenes. Young Desmond would stare for hours at the image accompanying the 6th commandment, Cain standing over his brother Abel's body, the first act of violence in Scripture. "Thou shalt not kill," 4 words that would define a life. When Desmond was a teenager, he and his brother Harold were wrestling when the roughhousing escalated. Without thinking, Desmond grabbed a brick and smashed it into Harold's head. Harold dropped unconscious. For a terrible moment, Desmond thought he'd taken his brother's life. The terror of that instant, the image of Cain and Abel flashing through his mind, carved itself into his soul. When Harold came to, Desmond made himself a promise. Never again would he raise his hand in violence. Another night brought more violence. His father and uncle got into a drunken argument that turned physical. William Doss pulled out a pistol and pointed it at his own brother. Desmond's mother threw herself between them, begging William to put the weapon down. Eventually he did, handing the gun to young Desmond. The weight of that pistol felt like holding death itself. From that moment, Desmond couldn't bear to touch a firearm. When Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Desmond faced an agonizing choice. He worked at Newport News Naval Shipyard, essential war work that exempted him from the draft. But his country was under attack. His brother was joining the Navy. How could he claim to love his neighbor while refusing to serve? On April 1st, 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the United States Army. But he did so with a declaration that would make him one of the most controversial soldiers in American military history. He would serve as a combat medic, face enemy fire alongside his unit, but under no circumstances would he carry a weapon or take a human life. He registered as a conscientious objector, though he disliked the term. He wasn't objecting to service, only to violence. The army didn't know what to make of him. Neither did the men at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. From the moment Desmond arrived at Fort Jackson with the 77th Infantry Division, he became the target of relentless harassment. While other recruits learned to field strip rifles, Desmond stood aside, refusing to touch the weapons. His drill instructors were baffled. Sergeant Howell couldn't comprehend how a soldier could serve without a gun. To the sergeant and other trainees, Desmond wasn't a conscientious objector. He was a coward hiding behind religion. The verbal abuse came first. "Doss, when we get into combat, I'll make sure you don't come back alive." That threat was delivered with cold sincerity. Others called him names, questioning his courage, his manhood, his sanity. When Desmond would kneel beside his bunk to pray each night, boots flew at him from across the barracks. Some men laughed, others watched in uncomfortable silence. Then came physical attacks. One night after lights out, several soldiers beat him in his bunk, leaving him bruised and bloodied. When officers investigated, Desmond refused to identify his attackers. To him, identifying them would have been seeking vengeance. His commanding officers weren't better. Captain Jack Glover and Sergeant Howell were convinced Desmond was mentally unfit and attempted to discharge him under Section 8 for psychiatric reasons. Desmond fought the discharge. His religion did not constitute mental illness. Making things worse was Desmond's Saturday Sabbath observance. Every Saturday he'd request a special pass to attend services, infuriating superiors and fellow soldiers who thought he was shirking responsibility. They didn't see that he made up the time on Sundays and volunteered for the hardest details. They only saw special treatment. Officers assigned him increasingly grueling labour, hoping to break him. They put him through exhausting physical ordeals, made him a pariah. The message was clear: if you won't leave voluntarily, we'll make your life miserable. But Desmond did not break. His faith wasn't a shield to hide behind. It was the core of who he was, and he would not compromise it. The situation reached its breaking point when basic training ended. Desmond planned to marry his sweetheart, Dorothy Shutter, during leave. But he was arrested for insubordination for refusing to carry a firearm. He faced court-martial and military prison. At the last moment, his father burst into the courtroom with documentation proving Desmond's conscientious objector status was legally protected. The charges were dropped. Desmond married Dorothy in a rushed ceremony before shipping out. As he left for war, Company B made their opinions clear. They didn't trust him. They didn't want him. Several had stated they'd handle the DOS problem themselves once bullets started flying. But combat reveals who people really are, and the men who tormented Desmond were about to discover that the skinny medic who wouldn't touch a gun possessed more courage than all of them combined. In July 1944, the 77th Infantry Division landed on Guam. For Desmond, this was the moment of truth. Would he freeze? Would he run? The answer came swiftly. During intense fighting, Desmond repeatedly ran into open ground under withering Japanese fire to reach wounded men. While bullets cracked past and mortars exploded around him, he'd treat injuries right in the kill zone, apply tourniquets with steady hands, drag soldiers to cover, and return for more. He moved with fearlessness that seemed impossible for someone dismissed as a coward. The men who'd threatened him watched in awe. This wasn't reckless stupidity. Desmond moved with purpose, with complete disregard for his own safety. For his actions on Guam, Desmond received the Bronze Star for Valor, the first of two he'd earned before Okinawa. After Guam came later in the Philippines, and again Desmond distinguished himself. By the time the 77th prepared for Okinawa, the men who'd once mocked Desmond now sought him out. They wanted Doss the medic with them. The threats had stopped. The harassment had ended. Desmond had earned their respect, but nothing could have prepared anyone for Okinawa. Operation Iceberg began April 1st, 1945. Over 180,000 American troops descended on Okinawa in the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. This island, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, was the final stepping stone before invading the Japanese home islands. Everyone knew Okinawa would be defended with fanaticism. Initial landings were surprisingly unopposed, but this was the calm before an unimaginable storm. Japanese Commander Lieutenant General Mitsuru Shijima had pulled his forces back to the southern end, spending months preparing elaborate defences anchored around Shuri Castle and protected by a series of ridges that turned the landscape into a fortress. The worst was a coral and limestone escarpment near Mida Village. American troops called it Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge was perhaps 400 feet high, but those 400 feet were nearly vertical, a sheer cliff face of jagged rock. The top 35 feet actually overhung the base, requiring cargo nets and ropes to climb. Getting up was hard. Staying up was nearly impossible. The Japanese had spent years fortifying this position. They dug a network of caves and tunnels into the limestone, creating an underground fortress invisible from above. Artillery and mortar positions were pre-sighted on every approach. Machine gun nests created interlocking fields of fire covering every square foot of the plateau. They'd perfected reverse slope defense, allowing Americans to climb the forward face relatively easily, then unleashing hell the moment troops crested the top. On April 29, 1945, the 307th Infantry Regiment, including Desmond's Company B, moved into position to relieve the battered 96th Infantry Division. The 96th had been fighting for Hacksaw Ridge for days with devastating casualties. Some companies had been reduced to less than 40% strength. For 5 days, the 77th fought to secure Hacksaw Ridge. It was brutal, close-quarters combat. Flamethrower teams would clear a cave, only to have Japanese soldiers emerge from hidden tunnels and attack from behind. Artillery hammered the plateau day and night. Men fought hand-to-hand in the caves. Through it all, Desmond moved among the wounded like a man possessed. While other medics were pinned down, Desmond would crawl through kill zones, dragging casualties to safety, treating wounds. He saved dozens of lives during those first days. But May 5th would be different. It was a Saturday, Desmond's Sabbath. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have fought that day, but men were in desperate need. So Desmond went up with his company for what everyone hoped would be the final push. The Japanese were waiting. As American troops crested the escarpment and fanned out, the enemy unleashed a coordinated counterattack of staggering violence. Artillery shells fell like rain. Mortars erupted everywhere. Machine guns opened from multiple directions. In minutes, 75 American soldiers fell wounded or dead. The advance disintegrated into chaos. Officers ordered a retreat. Get off the ridge, get down the cliff. The men who could move scrambled for the cargo nets. Within minutes, most of Company B had evacuated. But 75 men remained. Too wounded to walk, too hurt to crawl, scattered across the killing ground, bleeding, crying out for help. Military doctrine said those 75 were lost. You don't risk the living for the wounded when a position becomes untenable. Except Desmond Doss didn't retreat. As his company vanished down the cliff, as Japanese soldiers advanced to finish off the wounded as artillery continued pounding, Desmond stayed. He was the only man left, alone, unarmed, surrounded by enemy forces, and he began to pray. Lord, please help me get one more. Desmond crawled through chaos, moving from wounded man to wounded man. He'd assess injuries, apply pressure to wounds, administer morphine, speak words of comfort, then drag them through carnage toward the cliff's edge. When he reached the edge, he'd secure them with rope using a special bowline knot, then carefully lower them down the 35-foot overhang to medics waiting below. The rope would come back up, and Desmond would return into the smoke and fire. Lord, please help me get one more. He worked for 12 hours straight, 12 hours of crawling through hell, dodging enemy patrols, dragging wounded men who outweighed him significantly, lowering them one by one. Japanese soldiers passed within feet of him multiple times. Some survivors later swore they watched enemy troops walk right past Desmond without seeing him. Others reported that wounded Americans shot Japanese soldiers who were about to discover Doss, protecting their protector. The physical exertion was superhuman. Many wounded men weighed 180 to 200 pounds with gear. Desmond weighed maybe 145 pounds. He dragged these men, sometimes 100 yards or more across rough terrain. His hands blistered, then bled. His uniform shredded. He was covered in blood and sweat. But he didn't stop. Lord, please help me get one more. Captain Jack Glover, the same officer who'd once tried to have Desmond discharged as mentally unfit, lay among the wounded. He watched Desmond work throughout the day, watched him save man after man, watched him crawl past Japanese positions, and when Desmond finally reached Glover himself and lowered him to safety, the captain understood he'd witnessed something beyond mere courage. He'd witnessed faith made manifest. By nightfall, Desmond Doss had saved 75 men, every single soldier left behind on that plateau. Men written off as casualties went home to their families because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. When Desmond finally came down from Hacksaw Ridge, he collapsed from exhaustion. His hands were ruined, he was dehydrated, disoriented. Other soldiers had to carry him. The men who'd once threatened to shoot him now wept openly. The voices that called him coward now spoke his name with reverence. But Desmond wasn't finished. 16 days later, on May 21st, a grenade landed at his feet. The explosion shredded his legs with shrapnel. He lay in a shell crater, bleeding badly, and began treating his own wounds. He waited 5 hours for litter bearers. When they finally got him on a stretcher, the group came under tank attack. Seeing another soldier more critically wounded, Desmond crawled off his stretcher and ordered the bearers to take the other man first. While waiting alone again, a sniper's bullet shattered his left arm. With his good arm, he fashioned a splint using a discarded rifle stock. Then he crawled 300 yards across open ground until he reached the aid station. Desmond Doss's war was over. He was evacuated aboard USS Mercy, beginning a recovery that would take years and leave him permanently disabled. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman stood on the White House lawn with Medal of Honor recipients. When it was Desmond's turn, Truman said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Desmond Doss had become the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. But what the citation couldn't capture was the transformation he'd sparked. Captain Jack Glover later said, "He was one of the bravest persons alive, and then to have him end up saving my life was the irony of the whole thing." The soldiers who'd thrown boots at Desmond during prayers now spoke of him with awe. The man they'd called coward had proven braver than any of them. But Desmond never saw it that way. He'd done what his faith required. He'd loved his neighbour in the most literal, dangerous way possible. To him, there was no contradiction. Violence wasn't necessary for courage. All that mattered was being willing to face darkness to bring others into light. The army discharged Desmond in 1946, but his trials weren't over. He'd contracted tuberculosis during service. Doctors eventually removed one lung and 5 ribs. He spent much of the next 6 years in VA hospitals, fighting for his health the way he'd fought on Hacksaw Ridge, one day at a time. He married Dorothy, raising a son who would follow into military medical service. Desmond spent his remaining years speaking at churches and schools, always deflecting credit to God, always emphasizing that conviction mattered more than convenience, that faith required action. In 1991, Dorothy passed away in a car accident. He remarried in 1993 to Frances Dumas. Through declining health, Desmond remained the same man who'd climbed Hacksaw Ridge, humble, faithful, convinced he'd simply done what needed doing. On March 23, 2006, at age 87, Desmond Doss passed away at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. Hundreds of veterans attended his funeral, many of them men he'd saved, or their children paying respects to the medic who'd given their fathers a future. The story of Desmond Doss challenges everything we think we know about courage. He entered military service mocked and harassed by the very people he'd sworn to serve alongside. He faced court-martial for refusing to compromise his beliefs. He was beaten, threatened, ostracized. And he responded not with resentment or revenge, but with the most radical act of love imaginable. He laid down his life again and again for the men who tormented him. On Hacksaw Ridge, while 75 wounded soldiers lay scattered across a plateau controlled by enemy forces, Desmond Doss showed that one person's conviction could move mountains. That faith without action is empty, but faith coupled with courage can accomplish the impossible. That the weapons we refuse to carry might matter far less than the burdens we're willing to bear for others. They called him a coward. They said his pacifism was weakness. They threatened to abandon him in combat. But when every other soldier had fled to safety and 75 men lay dying, it was the pacifist who stayed. It was the man without a gun who walked through hell to bring his brothers home. It was Desmond Doss praying with every step, "Lord, please help me get one more," who demonstrated that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to become what your enemies are. His story isn't just history, it's a challenge to everyone who hears it. In a world that constantly tells us might makes right, that violence is strength, that compromise is wisdom, Desmond Doss showed another way. He showed that you can be absolutely unwilling to take life while being absolutely willing to risk your own to save others. That conviction doesn't mean inflexibility, it means knowing exactly what you'll die for. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the presence of purpose stronger than fear. 75 men went home because one man refused to leave them behind. 75 families got their sons, husbands, fathers and brothers back because a skinny kid from Virginia took "thou shalt not kill" seriously enough to organize his entire life around it. All because the man they'd mocked proved that love, real sacrificial love, is the most powerful force in the universe. If you found this story as powerful as I did, hit that like button and subscribe to Ignis Tempora. We bring you the stories that matter, the moments that shaped our world, the people who proved that one person with unshakable conviction can change everything. Desmond Doss climbed Hacksaw Ridge unarmed and came down a hero. His legacy is a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing what you won't do, and the greatest courage is doing what you must regardless of cost. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is about what's possible when ordinary people refuse to accept the world's definition of impossible.